So I'm going to begin today the talk by discussing an epistemological challenge concerning the simple substances de Châtelet posits, and with which I assume many of you are familiar. And then the main thesis of the paper is that in response to this epistemological challenge, de Châtelet provides evidence for these simples by using rules of induction that figure in her chapter on hypotheses. Then I'll talk a bit about how de Châtelet might fit into this recently discussed concept of inductive metaphysics, and then raise a few more open questions at the very end. So simple substances, again, this may be old news for most of you or all of you, but they are a metaphysical part of the institution that, on the other hand, seems to play some role in its philosophical mechanics and its broader project of explaining the action and interaction of bodies, for example, in collisions. But exactly how simple substances do play this role is maybe not so clearly understood, and I will maybe not be able to shed much light on that question today, but I at least want to start getting clearer on the epistemological status of these substances. So they face a perhaps fairly obvious problem that I'll get to, but first I'll mention some features of them for those who are less up on this part of the institution. As simple substances, they don't have parts, as you might expect. They also don't have extension or shape, she says. But then, very importantly, they contain what she calls internal determinations, which are the sufficient reason for everything found in composite beings. It's quite interesting here that if you take that literally, this suggests that there's no need to appeal to external determinations to give sufficient reason for everything found in composite beings, where external determinations might be distances or temporal relations between things, that the internal properties can do it all, if that's literally what she means. And then she also says, however, that seems to be slightly different, that these simple substances exert forces, and yet she calls these forces metaphysical forces, whatever that means exactly, or if it means anything different from regular forces. So these are some of her characterizations, but note that the key thing is that somehow these simple substances play an explanatory or even metaphysical role in what happens among composite beings, such as, tables, chairs, and things in everyday life. So this is where the epistemological problem arises. And it's sort of a common theme in a lot of early modern philosophy, this kind of broadly empiricist or experimentalist challenge. Here it's phrased as a challenge to just our knowledge of bodies. And the challenge is that we can't really discover the determinate properties of bodies completely a priori. We need to examine them, observe them, experience them, experiment on them. It's phrased in many ways. But the point is that if you can't know about bodies a priori, there's an apparently even worse problem for simple substances, which you seemingly can't know their properties a priori, but you also can't directly examine them, it appears. And de Châtelet doesn't think you can sort of directly perceive them. So then what is their epistemic status, and what can we say about them at all? To further kind of dig in on this problem, I would note that the early de Châtelet in her manuscript embraces this very same kind of idea that we need experience or experiments to know bodies' properties. She says in this earlier draft, it is only by this route, the route of experience or experiment, that we are assured that extension and impenetrability belong to bodies universally. We could not derive that a priori, she says, at least in the early manuscript. And we don't find such strong statements in the published version, but she still, in that published work, criticizes some hypotheses and other metaphysical posits as the poison of philosophy, in part because they lack observational support. And so this is a problem that Katherine Brading pointed out back in 2019. We can't directly observe simples, so the question is, could they possibly satisfy de Châtelet's own standards of observational support? So now to pull back to a kind of broader level, I just want to discuss some very broad genres of response to this sort of problem of the evidence for simples. So a committed rationalist might just reject this demand for empirical evidence and somehow try to argue completely a priori for the properties of bodies and simples and for their existence. So another fairly familiar response we might call hypothetico-deductive, which is not a priori and instead assumes, or it sort of posits simples on the basis that if we posit them, then that would entail true consequences. Therefore, we should posit them. And this is most familiar maybe from Huygens in his treatise on light. But Larry Loudon at least argues that various people in the 18th century revived this method. And Boscovich is relevant because he posits his own kinds of unobserved substances, apparently through this kind of argument. So those are two possibilities, but not the only possibilities. And in particular, there seems to be a third option, which is maybe less well discussed, which I'll call a hybrid response to this kind of epistemological problem. It's not quite the same as the hypothetico-deductive response because it does grant the need for inductive evidence, but then mounts a kind of a priori argument, which in this case would yield evidence for simples, or that would be the hope. Of course, that's very sketchy. So now we need to fill in what this sort of response might be by looking more carefully at what du Châtelet says in her argument for simple substances. But first, I want to make a negative point, which is that I don't think that the principle of sufficient reason can really do the relevant work here. She does accept this principle, as most of you know, and it roughly says that there exists nothing without a reason. But this does not exclude the possibility that nothing at all exists, because in that case, if nothing existed, this principle would be vacuously true. And in fact, the principle can only derive the existence of simple substances on the assumption that there is something already existing that the simple substances give a reason for. And somehow you might try to appeal to God here, but I don't think that's actually what she does. So instead, I take her argument for simples to have the following conditional and regressive form. Regressive in the sense that it's not a deduction from any of her first principles. It's instead regressing back from, well, some other kind of evidence, which we'll get to in a moment. It's not a traditional propter quid deduction. It's what used to be called a quia deduction. So the antecedent of the conditional would then be if bodies in general exist, and if they have certain properties, namely extension, passive force, and active force, then necessarily these bodies and properties are grounded in simple substances. So this allows there to be one form of justification for the entire conditional, the whole if-then statement, and another form of justification for the antecedent. I guess I'm giving this away, but I'm going to say that the whole conditional has an a priori justification, but the antecedent also has a posteriori inductive justification. So that's the next question on this slide is, how could we establish this antecedent? She, I think, stresses pretty clearly that we need to establish this antecedent for all bodies. You can't just point to one body or something and get the relevant, useful conclusion. The conditional argument will fail, I think, for her, unless we can establish a general conclusion about simples and not just that at least one simple exists or something like this. So I take her to think it's important to have an antecedent that has a general scope and does not just concern one body and the conditions for that one body, but deals with all bodies. That's why she refers to all bodies in her argument. And then I think this is maybe needs to be observed a bit more in the literature. Du Châtelet is very clear what establishes this antecedent when she discusses her argument for simples. She says, first of all, that experience proves that all bodies have extension, active force, and passive force, that all bodies have this. And she also states that we observe bodies as having these properties. So these passages indicate that she takes us to know these properties by experience. We don't know them simply by rational reflection, and we don't know them simply by the first principles of sufficient reason and contradiction. But of course, to observe a body is to observe a particular. Each experience or experiment is particular, not general. So there's a question of how do we generalize to all bodies from particular experiences? A very familiar problem, I guess, of induction. So here we can turn to yet another chapter for what might seem to be a solution, because I think it is a solution to some issues in Châtelet. And this is the chapter on essences, attributes, and modes. And in particular, one might appeal to our a priori knowledge of essences, something she is committed to, because these essences seem to support counterfactuals. They give us these kinds of necessary truths about natural kinds, such that we can make various claims about what would possibly be the case, and this outruns our actual inductive evidence. On the other hand, I don't think merely supporting counterfactuals is a replacement for induction, because it doesn't tell us actually what essences really exist and how they're instantiated. It might just be that we know something, we have some wonderful knowledge of a certain essence, but only one actual thing instantiates it. Nothing prevents that. In fact, no actual things might instantiate an essence, for all we know from contemplating essences. And I think this comes out very clearly in her own discussion of essences, another part of the discussion, her discussion that's maybe underappreciated in the literature, because she talks about really to get knowledge of essences, we observe actual particulars directly in front of us and find their unchanging properties, and then we generalize out from that. So even though somehow that generalization connects to our a priori knowledge of essences, we need to combine the a priori knowledge with observation to discern the actual pattern of instantiation of these essences in the world. So again, just mere contemplation of essences is not at all enough. Luckily, if we look back, especially to her earlier versions of the Institution, we find that she has quite a lot to say about induction, and in particular that she accepts Newton's third and fourth rules of reasoning in early drafts of the Institution. And now I'm going to say something controversial that I can't fully defend here, but do defend elsewhere, which is that I have argued that these same rules, the third and fourth rules of reasoning in natural philosophy, appear in a modified form in two of her own rules for hypotheses in her published work. So one of these modified Newtonian rules states that if we establish that a property belongs to all bodies on which we can experiment, then we can take that property as belonging to all bodies universally. Now, du Châtelet thinks that this taking is hypothetical, and that is something Newton would not agree with. He would take it to be a stronger attitude than hypothesis. But there's still a lot of similarity, I think, between her and Newton on this score. And then there's also what I take to be a very close analog to the fourth rule. She says that these hypotheses can then be assumed as true until some contrary experiment shows that they're wholly false. So they can't be falsified by merely speculative metaphysical hypotheses, also very close to Newton's views on the matter in his attempts to prevent speculative metaphysicians from attempting to undermine his inductively established propositions. I should also add another difference. This is an aside, but interesting difference about this Rule 4-like thing is that du Châtelet does not mention something Newton mentions in his rule, which is further experiments might make a hypothesis more exact. And interestingly, she also does not mention exactness in her manuscript translation of Newton's fourth rule, which actually might represent her considered view better, because we don't actually know if the published version of her translation might have been meddled with by Clara or something. Anyway, she seems to interestingly de-emphasize the exactness aspect of Newton's discussion of these hypotheses, of these experimentally supported propositions, just in favor of contrary experiments or evidence. But that's just an aside. For those of you interested in this topic, maybe work is to be done there. Okay, so coming back now to the antecedent and summing up the kind of evidence for it, I think her texts are extremely clear that this evidence must invoke experience and observation. But I think this is a bit of a reconstruction, that for it to be generalized, she has to be drawing on her chapter on hypotheses, and specifically the rules that I take to parallel Newton's rules 3 and 4. Please note, though, that the claim that they parallel Newton is logically separate from the claim that they're involved in her argument for simples. So if you don't like the Newton part, you can disagree with that and still agree with my broader reading that there's still an inductive premise in her argument for simples, and we can happily agree on that. And maybe my paper that I mentioned here can persuade you of the Newton connection. But again, it's not essential to the main point about the structure of her argument. Okay, now this is a very busy slide, conceptually and textually, but I want to say a word about how she supports the whole conditional that's still in the box here. I think that she somehow uses the principle of sufficient reason to support that whole conditional. So it is supposed to be a priori as a whole conditional. And her reasoning is something like the following, that the properties of bodies can't be explained in terms of those very same types of properties. She thinks that there's a kind of explanatory circularity or not enough distance between what's explained and what explains it. If you do that, if you, for example, explain something extended in terms of something else extended, or explain why it's extended in terms of some extended part of it, whatever that is, she thinks that simples are very different from bodies, so they can avoid this problem. I partly raise this just to stress that it plays up something that I have defended also elsewhere about her sufficient reason principle, which is that for her, a sufficient reason need not just be, or can't just be, in some cases, some sort of ground or cause for what we want to explain. Certain grounds or causes aren't going to provide satisfactory explanations, according to Châtelet. For example, explaining extension in terms of other extended things, even though that's a ground of some kind, it's not a satisfactory explanation. So in this case, it would violate the principle of sufficient reason. Now, I don't necessarily think that she has a very compelling argument here, but I'd be happy to hear more if from anyone in the audience, if you have thoughts on how she supports this conditional and how she can avoid, whether this circularity problem applies to her own simples as an explanation. So let me sum up the last section. As I've said, to give evidence for simples, I take to Châtelet to not just invoke her first principles plus particular empirical phenomena. There needs to be some kind of inductive role, which I take to come from her chapter on hypotheses and the methodological rules she presents for her hypotheses there. And then once again, this is a logically separate point, that I take these rules to arguably parallel Newton's rules 3 and 4, but that's not really essential to my argument today. So now I want to step back a little bit and talk about du Châtelet in the context of a category that has recently become popular in the historiography of 18th century philosophy and science. This is the category of inductive metaphysics. So there was a big special issue in the Graz Philosophical Studies journal a few years ago, edited by Engelhardt and others, on this idea of inductive metaphysics. And I'm looking at it because it seems to sound a little bit like the kind of hybrid view I was sketching earlier. When Engelhardt and her co-editors describe inductive metaphysics, they also lay out two kind of extreme alternatives. One extreme is that metaphysics is purely a priori. The other extreme is that everything must go and independent metaphysics should just be dissolved into particular sciences and philosophies of science. And so they say that inductive metaphysics falls in between these extremes because it stresses the role of empirical sources and methodology for metaphysical investigations, and also stresses a prioristic tools for metaphysics. And just one thing to flag here is that so far this is very broad, because empirical sources could be almost anything, any kind of experience maybe might count as this. So even a cogito, or as Pedro pointed out, cosmological arguments, or Aristotle's metaphysics, which according to the posterior analytics has some inductive support. Lots of metaphysics would fall under this very broad definition. So I want to sort of slightly intervene in this discussion by maybe looking at what might really be best qualified as inductive metaphysics, if we could maybe narrow down its definition a bit more. So I think that in particular, if anyone counts as an inductive metaphysician during the 18th century, it seems like du Châtelet, with this argument I've been sketching, would count as just this kind of metaphysician, not just because she uses empirical sources or experience in metaphysics. That's kind of very broadly done. I think what's interesting is that on my reading, she's using empirical methodology of some kind, namely these Newtonian rules for hypotheses. And then as I've argued, to complete the inference, to validate this whole conditional, she also uses a prioristic tools, and that would be the principle of sufficient reason. So now I just want to briefly talk about Wolff merely as a contrast with du Châtelet, And again, this is prompted by recent discussions of Wolff as an inductive metaphysician, which is kind of a counterintuitive idea, though maybe not to some participants in this conference who've also worked on this topic. But there are two papers with very similar names by Christina Engelhardt and Christian Leduc on Wolff's different dimensions of Wolff's metaphysics that suggest that this metaphysics does appeal to experience and may even be inductive. So they have I think, a fairly good case of this in the passage that I have on the left, where Wolff is arguing for bodies having inherent force. A premise for his argument is that every body is able to move another body. So that seems to be somehow inductive. But what about his argument for simples? Is it inductive? Well, I'm going to say it's not so inductive. And thus, this shows, for one thing, that du Châtelet is not following Wolff when it comes to this argument. So there's a major difference between them. And also that I think she fits better this characterization of inductive metaphysics than Wolff does, despite what some people in the literature have said. So to very briefly sketch Wolff's argument for simples, he says that everything we're conscious of that's external to us is composite. And then I'll quote that if there are some composite things, there must also be some simple beings. Somehow that's supposed to follow from sufficient reason, he thinks. And therefore, he concludes that there are some simple beings. So the first point I want to make is that this is maybe an experiential argument, but it's not obviously inductive in any meaningful sense. And it doesn't invoke any kind of methodology from natural science, as far as I can tell, either. There's no step from what we've experienced to material things in general, or to really anything beyond my personal experience, I think. I don't know. There's an us that he mentions, but it all seems very kind of internal to the experiences of an individual subject. And I mean, it's clearer from the actual text, but the first premise in particular concerns the experiences of composite representations, which creates a big problem for his inference, because the second premise does not refer to representations, it refers to things or substances. Therefore, the argument looks invalid, because premise one does not actually satisfy the antecedent in premise two. Premise one could just be about something like minima sensibilia, or so what it deserves is some kind of inference to non-composite representations, not non-composite beings. So his argument faces a big problem, I think, because of this lack of consideration of, really the kind of evidence he needs to provide in this hybrid argument. And then finally, he doesn't really prove what he wants to prove, even if we accept that his argument's valid, because his conclusion is really just that at least one simple exists, and not that it actually grounds matter, or that there are many finite simple substances grounding matter throughout the world. It could just be that there's one super simple substance like God that grounds all matter with no intervening layer of simple substances. So in short, Wolff does not have a very inductive argument. Du Châtelet's is both different and, to my mind, more like inductive metaphysics, if we want to take that category seriously in the history of philosophy and science. So one last thing about this, the emphasis on metaphysics in inductive metaphysics could suggest that an inductive metaphysician is still a metaphysician, and as a result must embrace necessary knowledge of things, that their conclusions should be absolutely certain and necessary. And so I want to note a quote from Hume, which du Châtelet wouldn't have known, but it's in the voice of a kind of traditional metaphysician. And it states, Hume writes, that if there be any suspicion that the course of nature may change, that the past may be no rule for the future, all experience becomes useless and can give rise to no inference or conclusion. So the thought is that if you're relying on induction for your metaphysical arguments, then those won't be certain, and for a traditional metaphysician, they won't really generate true, genuine inferences or proper conclusions at all. So there's a question of, or a sort of fork in the road for an inductive metaphysician. Should they embrace kind of a probabilistic response to this, or should they allow that, if their foundations for induction are imperfect, their metaphysical conclusions might be probabilistic? My view is that du Châtelet also faces this kind of fork in the road, because she's explicitly a probabilist about inductive hypotheses. So where those are concerned, she would reject this claim of Hume's and just allow that our inferences and conclusions aren't absolutely certain rather. So as a result, there's pressure for her to embrace probabilism about the results of inductive metaphysics too. So that would imply that the existence of simples and their properties is also merely probable and uncertain. She does not embrace this consequence, though, which raises questions about why she doesn't do so and what her ultimate epistemology is here. So I wanted to conclude with that, but I think it's worth noting that this is a general problem for also a Wolff or a Leibniz or even Kant in some of his moments, not just for Châtelet. So everyone kind of faces this question. And well, I have more questions that I'll conclude with, aside from those, I guess. So first of all, I want to go back to the very beginning, because I said I sort of raised the issue of how simples fit into Châtelet's physics, and then I didn't answer anything about that issue, and I still haven't, but I want to sort of remind you that it's an open question. In particular, it's an open question exactly what kind of explanation or role simples are playing in the institution. It's sort of not completely obvious that they're supposed to provide causal explanations of bodies and their properties, because she, as many of you probably know, she has a passage where she claims that physics would proceed exactly the same if we did not commit to simples. And she also says that they're a metaphysical truth, which is maybe not a physical truth. In any case, open question, maybe someone can answer this for me. And then next, relatedly, I'm still curious about the evidence for Châtelet's laws of motion, which do not seem supported directly by the metaphysics of simples, but they might be supported by her Newtonian account of hypotheses and induction, or by her account of hypotheses and induction. So that's something else I'm curious about looking at in further work. And then finally, the big question I'm sure has already occurred to you about the rules for inductive hypotheses themselves. What is the basis for these rules? They themselves should not be inductive, because then there will be circularity. But this raises the question, are they just kind of theological? Is it just that Châtelet assumes that God makes the world easy for us to understand, or is there some other basis for them? In any case, open question. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.